Beg your pardon. Do you want me to repeat all that? No. I know how difficult it is to hear it if you're viewing it online. So my name's Councillor Andrew Brown, for those watching on eDemocracy virtually. And I just want to mention an item of housekeeping, and this includes me as well. If you want to mute your phones or switch them off for added certainty, please do so. Right. If I can ask the officers today just to introduce themselves, if they would, please.
Morning, I'm Mark Ashwell. I'm the Planning and Policy Manager at the District Council.
Good morning, I'm Caroline Dodden. I'm a Senior Planning Policy Officer.
Good morning, Lauren Gregory, Democratic Services Officer.
Thank you for that. So turning to the agenda, apologies for absence. I think we have one or two, don't we?
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies for absence have been received from the Vice Chairman, Councillor Pauline Grove-Jones, with Councillor Liz Withington in attendance as a substitute.
Thank you, Councillor Withington, for substituting this morning. Public questions, next item.
There are no public
There are
questions.
no public questions. Right, so we move to the minutes of the last meeting. I do thank Councillor Grove-Jones for chairing that in my absence. So if we turn to pages 1 to 7, I think it is it? Sorry, 8 in the agenda. Now, unusually, I have spotted 1 or 2 glitches in the minutes, nothing substantive. So what I would like to do is ask for a proposal to make amendments to them under delegated authority rather than go through them, because they could take some time to go through it line by line and get everybody's agreement. So if I could have a proposer to do that, and a seconder, please. Thank you. So Councillor Gay, Councillor Pritchard seconding. That would be very helpful.
I'm very happy to propose that, but I just wondered what your major concern might have been.
In the minutes?
Yeah.
It's just tidying up, in actual fact. There's just, some spelling mistakes. There's just, grammatical corrections.
Okay, good.
Which I went through quite carefully because I wasn't at the last meeting, perhaps more carefully than I normally would do. So if we just go through them, so page 1, for anything else that members may have noticed. Page 2, this is just for accuracy. Page 3, page 4, 5. Councillor Gay.
Thank you, Chairman. I think I meant to imply that the design guide should be regularly utilised at Development Committee. I'm not suggesting a change here, it's fine as it is, but I think what I wanted to say was not that it always was, but that it really should be. But that's not important. Thank you.
Have any, do we? No. Any declarations of interest, members, using the guidance in the agenda papers to declare? Speak now, forevermore hold your peace. Item 6 is update on matters from the previous meeting. I don't know, I don't know whether there's anything to say about the infrastructure delivery
was-
plan, which is sort of still
Yeah.
in its gestation.
I was going to mention that because it didn't come up under the minutes. So at the last meeting, we preemptively tabled an item about infrastructure delivery, and you were quite rightly critical that I was asking you to sign off on the content of a document you'd not even seen. And the IT failed and we didn't get sort of schedule of the infrastructure proposals up on the screen for you. And I gave an undertaking, I'd bring that back in some guise or other. I have seen a much more up-to-date, I'm going to say almost complete version of the document. So I'd like to bring it back to the working party when I think it's a finished piece of work and do a proper job of the presentation. So either next month or the month after, that will come back as a final piece of work for your approval.
Are you ready, Caroline, to introduce it?
I am indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Morning, everyone. I hope that you've had a chance to read the Working Party report and have a quick look through the draft coastal adaptation supplementary planning document. I think I'll refer it to just SPD now because it's quite a long-winded title. By a short introduction, I'm the council's representative on a joint steering group, which has been set up specifically to produce a coastal adaptation SPD. The steering group includes officers from East Suffolk Council, Great Yarmouth Borough Council, the Broads Authority and the Shared Coastal Partnership East. And we've got Rob Goodliff, the coastal manager, here this morning, who I think might say a few words as well, but he's also on the steering group. The group's prepared the draft SPD to build upon the statement of common ground on coastal zone planning that was agreed between the partnership authorities in September 2018. If we can just move down to section 2, please, Lauren. Thank you. The overarching aim of the draft SPD is to provide a whole coast approach with regard to our aligned planning policies across the participating authorities. I think it's quite useful to show the map in the SPD, which I think is on page 23 of your agenda pack, which shows the red line in effect shows the significant extent of the coast and obviously the related coastal change management area, which obviously is quite a vast area of land that will be covered by this planning guidance from Holcombe in the west, right the way around the coast to Felixstowe in the south. An initial consultation exercise regarding the proposed subjects and structure of the SPD was undertaken in the autumn of 2020. And since then, the steering group has met regularly to progress this document using the initial consultation feedback as its starting point. We have had other informal stakeholder engagement with, for example, bodies like the Environment Agency and other organisations, which we've sort of had meetings this year, which has further informed the content and details of this document. If we can just go to the contents page, I'm not going to go through each part of the document, but most importantly, I think it's useful to know that this document has been positively prepared. We're trying to focus on the potential opportunities for coastal adaptation. So in effect, say at chapter 4, we're talking about the types of development that are likely to be acceptable. Obviously, so there are some that are not, but we're trying to focus in on the ones that are. And also talking about coastal erosion vulnerability assessments so that if someone is putting in an application, they know the sort of details that we're requiring as part of that application. Chapter 5 looks at the rollback and relocation of buildings and the types of infrastructure that may be at risk to coastal change now, and obviously particularly with regards to climate change in the future. Chapter 6 discusses the potential for enabling development to support coastal adaptation projects going forward. if we can just scroll down a bit. The appendices are also hopefully quite useful. We've got a number of case studies which provide helpful examples of coastal adaptation best practice. And there's also examples of model conditions, vulnerability assessment templates, and also some neighbourhood plan guidance as well. The progress of the draft SPD is very time sensitive. It requires a consideration by a number of committees and working parties of all the participating authorities during November and December. And our collective aim is for the commencement of the formal consultation to start in January 2023. I don't know, Rob, if you'd like to say a few words before we go to the recommendation.
Yes, thank you very much. So, yeah, my name's Rob Goodliffe. I was until very recently the coastal manager in the Coastal Partnership East chaired team. I'm now the Coastal Transition Accelerator Programme Manager for Norfolk District Council. I'll mention that just at the end of what I'm going to say. I won't keep you too long, so don't worry. So, I'd just like to say that Norfolk District Council was one of the first local authorities or local planning authorities to develop sort of coastal policies within the local plans or the core strategy as was. This is very much then sort of developed further and brought into sort of national guidance and has been adopted sort of nationally across almost all local authorities on the coastline. Now, coastal change impacts are going to increase sort of moving forwards in light of climate change. The sea level here has been rising for a long period of time, and this side of the coast is dipping down, but we are seeing an acceleration in sea level rise, and it's likely we're going to have more impacts with increased storminess, increased rainfall, which are all key drivers on our coastline. So our shoreline management plans do sort of look at that and are currently going through a refresh process. But very much we're going to continue to protect where we can do, but it's not going to be sort of economically feasible, environmentally acceptable or technically viable to protect all locations. So there really is a real need to look to adapt our coastlines. Now, these planning policies and this SPD, which helps to sort of clarify the planning policies, is that what I would see as a key part of this adaptation or transition jigsaw moving forwards. It gives us a good policy setting to enable us to obviously move forward with working with and helping communities and businesses adapt. So the SPD does provide that clarity, and hopefully will help encourage people to take forward those opportunities that those planning policies provide. But we do need to remain flexible as well. Coastal change and the way that we manage it moving forwards through policies is evolving. There will be opportunities that do present themselves, which we haven't thought of yet. The market might not have invented yet. So we do need to have that flexibility. And so in the SPD, we've tried to sort of highlight that, and we may try to highlight that even more to say that if people do have ideas which perhaps aren't captured, please do come and talk to us rather than thinking, no, we can't do this. There needs to be more conversation. So moving forwards, as I said, my role is changing into the Coastal Transition Accelerator Programme, which is a national initiative to drive forward with planning for coastal change. And we are one of 2 local authorities in England to be selected by DEFRA to do this. And this SPD will greatly help actually in those discussions and providing that policy setting and that guidance. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob, for that. Well, this is a very important document, isn't it? We all know how important the coast is to us, and it's one of the most important areas of work that this district council does. And I'm pleased to see that the cabinet member for the coast, Councillor Angie Fitch-Tillett, is with us in the meeting today, and I'm sure she'll have plenty to say about this as we move forward. I have a hand raised from Councillor Dixon. If you'd like to come in.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to pick up on the point of flexibility, if I may, because I think I recognise the need for that, but I'm also a little concerned that local plans and the fixing of policies tends to create a framework which we tend to depend upon when we're making decisions with regard to applications for a range of things. and quite reasonably, the applicants rely on that policy framework as well in making its own applications, their own applications. So I'm just wondering whether we could just hear a little bit more about how that flexibility would be demonstrated over the period of the plan, and that we don't box ourselves into a corner whereby the policy says this and the applicant reasonably is saying this is the policy context. And so how do we kind of work our way through that in such a way that it is going to achieve what coastal management needs to achieve, and also how the expectations of applicants might be met as well, because there is this tension, this conflict here. And I'm not at all clear about how that would work in practice on a day-to-day basis. So I'd like to hear a bit more about how that's going to work, please.
If you want to come in on that, Mark, to explain.
Yeah, I think I'm probably going to struggle to give you a direct answer because you get into a position where if you have policies which incorporate lots of flexibility, you don't have a policy. You know, the rules are applied so flexibly that it's not worth actually having the rules in the first place. So the two fundamental principles which are in the policy, one is about managing risk, so the types of development that would be permitted in the coastal zone. And I think there's pretty much universal agreement about the types of development that are appropriate and the types of development that are not appropriate. And I'd be very surprised if there's a lot of debate about that. Where it's more difficult is the application of what we call the rollback policy, where we're trying to remove developments which are at risk. They're in the coastal area and we want to move them somewhere else. And we've discussed in the past sort of how we can ensure that rather than just accepting rollback as a principle, in some way that we incentivize rollback and make it happen. So we've tweaked our policies a little bit from the core strategy. The core strategy has got some very, I would describe, rigid controls in it. So for example, if you were looking to replace a dwelling that's at risk and build a dwelling elsewhere, our current policies require like for like replacement. To the extent that we micromanage floor space, we get the applicant to measure the size of the building and they only get permission for replacement building of the same size. That feature doesn't exist in the new policy. We've deliberately made the new policy more flexible and said it doesn't really matter if the replacement dwelling is bigger, provided the replacement dwelling is not harmful, measured against design, landscape, and all the other criteria in the plan. So that's an illustration of where we've injected a degree of flexibility. And obviously it would be for the development committee to look at the proposal and determine whether there were any harmful impacts associated with the new building. So that's a sort of an illustration of where we tried to be more flexible. One of the debates which is ongoing, it may come up in the discussion about coastal management policies when we look at the policies themselves rather than the SPD, is the extent to which rollback proposals should be related to the community within which they're happening. So take that replacement dwelling example. Our current policies do not require replacement dwellings to be located in, I'm going to describe it as the host community. So if you remove a house in Haysborough, policy currently allows that house to be rebuilt anywhere else in the district adjacent to a settlement. So it could be rebuilt in Houghton or Wells or North Walsham. In that respect, our new policy is actually a little bit more restrictive. We've said that actually it's important that if you're replacing development, that the replacement development should be in the same community, because the message that underlies the policy is about sustaining places. It's about sustaining Haysborough and Walcott and other places along the coast. And if you give the message that what you want to do is remove the risk and put development elsewhere, it creates the wrong sort of underlying message that it's about place. good example would be the relocation of Haysborough Caravan Park, which was very contentious when it went through committee. I think it's been quite successful. That's a facility that was in Haysborough and stays in Haysborough. It would have been no good in my mind to take that caravan park and put it in Wells or Fakenham or Holt, because it wouldn't have played to that whole idea. It's about sustaining communities in the places where there is risk. The other area of flexibility, and I'm a bit glib saying this, is around departures from policy. Policies provide the framework for decisions, and the development committee is often presented with reasons why they should depart from a policy. You know, you've got a policy approach which tries to deliver this. My proposal doesn't quite fit the bill. It doesn't tick all of the boxes, but nevertheless, it's a worthwhile proposal. It's got merit and it's something you should approve. And that's about the way that the development committee applies weight to all those other material considerations and makes decisions. I think writing a policy that tries to identify what all of those material considerations are on a case-by-case basis would be very, very difficult, actually. I don't know whether that actually answers your question, but I think it's about having certainty, having set criteria, having expectations about what applicants have got to comply with. And it's around the way that the policies are applied. And one of the virtues of the SPD is it can be updated. It's not like a local plan where you have to, go in front of an inspector and justify wording of a policy. You can update your SPD year on year on year, which is about how you apply your policies and the rules you will use at that stage. So the very nature of having an SPD is it does give you flexibility around the way that you implement your policies, guidance.
Can I just respond to that? There are two issues for me. One is that the kind of flexibility that you are looking for?
Essentially, yes, it is. When we come to sort of look and work with local communities, there are different expectations, but also each community is different as well. Land availability is a classic one in local communities where you might be trying to move something from A to B, but there's limited land holdings, landowners, and some may be willing, some may not be willing. So there could be times when you're trying to roll back assets in a community, but it's not possible because the land isn't available. So then there needs to be some consideration of flexibility. Or it may be that there's already a land holding which that individual or business, etc., might have access to somewhere else, which would be logical to use that. So that would be something for, as Mark was saying, the planning committee to consider. With the SPD, obviously, it can be updated, and within this one, we've tried to provide some case studies because we do have some of those now of where planning policies have been used for various different developments. And I think moving forwards, as we get more case studies, I think they're important to include those as well, to give people sort of ideas of what may be possible. And I think personally, I think we do need to continue to have that sort of open dialogue actually with what the needs and expectations around the businesses, individuals and communities are as well, because we will come to a time when we might revise the policies in the future, and then that will give us the evidence base from which to work to make adjustments, to improve them, to give either the flexibility or make them more rigid where they need to be. So it's something we need to keep learning from, I think, as we move forwards.
Thank you for that. The second part is that, yes, I think you have answered the question in part. And I completely agree with your opening statement that if you have sort of carte blanche flexibility, then you don't have a policy, you don't have a policy framework. So that and I think you've also said that if you start listing criteria, then that can make life very complicated as well. But I just wonder whether there is something that can be done just to amplify what's being looked for here and to try and define the kind of circumstances when that might arise, to give us the wriggle room that would allow that kind of thing to happen without becoming prescriptive about it.
Okay, so me and Rob have had a discussion about this beforehand, perhaps hence the line of questioning, I don't know. So there's two things we could do. In the preamble to the policy, you set out what the policy is trying to achieve. You say, you know, this policy is about managing risk along the coast. These are the objectives of the policy. These are the reasons why we're doing things. And in that preamble, you might include some wording around, you know, the policy will be applied flexibly, or in the first instance, priority will be given to. And by using that language, you then create the space for the sort of discussions that we're alluding to here, because applicants will then say, well, the policy says X, Y, and Z, but the justification for the policy talks about these things being required in the first instance. In other words, there's space for something else. So you've got the certainty of the policy criteria, but you've got the flexibility in the reasoned explanations to why you're doing things. And I think that might be something we could accommodate, just to say that, you know, we haven't got a crystal ball. Things do change over the years. There may be things in 2 or 3 years' time we know nothing about. And we don't want a local plan in place for the next 15 years, which prevents those virtuous things from happening. So just that little bit of tweaking to the terminology would probably, I think, give us what we're looking for. What was the second point? Well, yeah, so you could put that sort of flexibility in the reason justification for the policy, or you could amend the policy criteria themselves so that flexibility is embedded in the actual policy. Now, that leads you into difficult territory around when you put flexibility in, it does open the door to applicants arguing for things that we would find unacceptable, but they nevertheless will say, well, it complies with your own policy because your policy says these things are okay. So my instinctive response is to put that degree of flexibility into the reason justification for the policy and have some fairly, we'll use the word rigid, fairly clear, precise criteria in the policy themselves that are easy for the development committee and others to get their heads around, say, I need to do these things in order to comply. But put the flexibility in the reason justification. And those are the sorts of modifications and clarifications we can make at this stage in preparing the plan. And as I say, it's an issue that Rob's raised with me directly to have a think about. What we're talking about here is consulting on a draft of an SPD. We're not talking about the policies themselves. So that sort of decision would need to come back when we look at the coastal management policies as part of this modification process. So I think probably that means what I'm going to do is go away and come up with some wording that I think that we can collectively be comfortable with and table that as a potential modification when we discuss those policies.
Thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, I would therefore just ask that we perhaps consider this as a recommendation at the end of this to take it forward and for that to be included in whatever way is judged to be best in the final version.
Go ahead. I thought you meant you were going to propose some wording. I thought you might have prepared it.
So I think the proposal at the end of any further discussion should be to agree the draft SPD for public consultation, subject to further consideration as to how the policies can be flexibly implemented or something, wording to that effect. So we can just get some appropriate wording both into the SPD if necessary and the supporting text of the policy so that they're aligned.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to say that I thought this was an extremely good document. It was lucid and well composed, and it was good to read, and I learned an awful lot from reading it. So I wanted to say thank you for that. I'd like to just give 3 examples of the way in which I think it's particularly illustrative and well composed. It explains very well the interlocking plans and policies which apply in these cases, and they're all perfectly referenced. So anyone with this document can go back to to the underlying work and see the way in which things fit together. And I always think that that's a sign of a really good document. I'd also like to give two tiny examples of things where in 2.7, where it explains about, coastal drift and so on. Someone was asking me about this 4 weeks ago, and I was really floundering in my attempt to explain. Well, now I could just say to them, look at this document, paragraph 2.7, it's all explained very clearly. Another simple example is paragraph 4.4, where it explains about the timings for coastal erosion, and explains very clearly you cannot infer that halfway through you'll have suffered half the effects. And these are just some simple examples of the way in which I think it is very, very, very well composed. And the case studies are also useful, and it's good to see Haysborough cited here, because I do think that was a success for this council. The matter of flexibility is not of so much concern to me, because I think at various points in this document, it's made quite clear that there will be planning decisions, there will have to be interpretation. It says that constantly there are competing interests. These are competing interests, and obviously they have to be weighed by the decision maker. There's also quite a strong section on the need for public benefit and local benefit. And again, I think this makes it clear that there are matters here which will have to be judged. And I'd like the wording in the introduction, which, what does it say here? I was just checking it. While we hope this document provides useful guidance for a range of scenarios, it will not be possible to address the complexity of issues in every scenario. And I think that makes it, to me, that makes it fairly clear. So I wanted to praise this document because I think it's good, and I think it will be helpful over the years. I'd just like to say something more philosophical about all this at the end. I've always seen this as a matter of social justice, a treatment of people who live along our coast. It is a social justice issue. And while the rest of the nation may think of our coastal issues as uniquely privileged areas with lovely sand and sea, and in actual fact, these are often areas with lower income and lower health and lower medical provision. So I just think whenever we consider this, we should take that into account. Anyway, thank you. I think it's good. Thank you.
That's okay. Councillor Toy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Councillor Gay for covering most of what I wanted to say to start with. When you're working with something dynamic and difficult like this and unknown, and the weather can change, and just, I think it's a great document that's tried to tackle all the potential things that are there, but acknowledging we don't know everything. So thank you for the work that must have gone into this. Councillor Dixon effectively raised the same question that I'd found, which was about how it fits with our policies. He actually gave an example there of how our new policies, we've now allowed a bit of flexibility in building size. And if I've remembered what I've read in here, because it's, we've not had as many hours on it perhaps as yourselves, but actually you've said that it should be like for like in size in this document is my recollection. So, but that is how it would be on top of our policies. We have a policy and their SPD does not challenge our policies. So my question was going to be in a slightly different way is, are we comfortable that we've worked a long while on developing our policies for the new plan? Are we comfortable that this document is not introducing anything that will challenge our policies, that it does sit on top? So that was going to be my approach to what is essentially the same question. Thank you.
Yes. So I think it's fair to say, although we worked collectively across the whole of the length of coast with our neighbours, there are some subtle variations in policy approach. So that like for like replacement dwelling policy, I think, does appear in some of the local plans of our partners. We're not all universally in precisely the same sort of place. So I'm going to suggest, and I think we can do this after the consultation, so not before, there might be a little editorial sort of exercise to do on this document just to align things, because it's entirely appropriate or acceptable for people to have slightly different approaches. You'd like to all be in exactly the same place, but if one of the authorities wants to pursue an approach that says, actually, we're comfortable with like for like, we want to measure floor areas, we want to be quite prescriptive, that's their decision. It's not for us. And so this document might have to say, you know, where policies are in place, you will need to do this, to just cover off those slight subtle differences from one authority to another. Another example is some of the authorities require quite strict occupancy controls. They say if you live in house A and you're benefiting from a permission to replace that dwelling, then you should occupy it. We're not bothered about that. We don't mind whether the occupant is Joe Bloggs or Mr. Smith or whoever it is. What we're concerned with is removing the risk from the coastal location in terms of getting rid of the property and the person that lives in it, and whether the replacement dwelling is occupied by that person or not, we're not concerned with. So those slight differences probably need to be referenced in here in a way which allows the guidance to be used effectively by all of the partners, because they've got slight differences of approach.
Yeah.
But I think that's something we do after the consultation, John, when because others might raise some more fundamental concerns, different issues that will require modification. So it is only the consultation draft.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's just that it needs to be a supplementary document and not something that comes back and challenges our documents. It must be just supplementary.
That's
to-
precisely-
Except it needs to fit
Yeah.
with all the different authorities.
Got it.
But so if that's the point to do it, then that's fine. I'm comfortable with
Yeah,
that.
that
But
is-
that was my
That
question.
is precisely the point. It is not a policy document. It's how you apply your policies in a consistent and logical way and guide applicants. You know, information requirements to make a successful application, you'll have to submit a risk assessment of some sort, and this is the sort of information you will need to include. That's what SPDs do. They don't write the policy for you.
And we just need to make sure
Yeah.
that's what this is doing.
Yeah.
So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And they are in fact a material consideration as of right, aren't they, as a supplementary planning document? That's the essence of it. You don't have to argue the case that the content of it is a material consideration.
They're
That
often
is in there.
they're often sort of by I'm going to use the word sleight of hand, but it's not really a sleight of hand. They are referenced in policies. So you will often see a policy that says you'll get planning permission subject to X, Y, and Z in accordance with the design guide or the coastal erosion, you know, whatever it might be. And in that way, you're importing the SPD into the way that you apply the policy. We had a lot of debates about the meaning of have regard to, comply with, take account of, the content of, and what wording we might get away with in order to strengthen the value of these types of things. Because if you just say have regard to, you know, a point Virginia is often made, having regard to means, well, I read it and then I forgot about it and I didn't really do much about it. Complying with is at the other end of the scale where there's no flexibility. You've got to comply entirely with the content of it. And there's some wording in there you can get away with. We came up with comply with or justify a departure from, which gives you that a bit more sort of power to your elbow, saying, well, the starting point is you should be complying with this unless you justify a departure from it, and that's where your flexibility comes in. So those sort of words start to appear in local plan documents, you know, as a footnote to your policy.
Thank you. Sort of it's to do, going back slightly to the questions and discussion about flexibility. I think flexibility is one of those words that it can mean several different things, can't it? What I think I haven't seen used and would like to see something, maybe it's in this preamble that you're talking about, and it links to something that's in 4.11 on page 36, where it says there's like to be proposals that do not meet national policy and guidance, blah, 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 but that could provide new and innovative opportunities to manage the transition. I haven't heard the word responsive. And I think that's one of the big issues that we're going to have to do, is we're going to have to be
proactively responsive, haven't we, and change what we're doing, because we don't exactly know, it's not a precise science, what's going to happen. And I think for that reason, I think it's important to have that in that preamble, as well as being flexible, because I think that gives a sense of purpose for what we're trying to do here. We're trying to manage and respond accordingly to what we don't know is going to happen, which is always extremely difficult. Thank you.
An element of crystal ball gazing, isn't there? I don't really know how to respond to that, actually.
Well, I've made a note to myself to think carefully about the use of language, whether we use the word flexible or responsive.
Councillor Punchard.
Thank you. I don't know if she's willing or able, but if Councillor Fitch-Tillett would be willing to say something because of her knowledge base of planning policy development and coastal, it'd be good to hear her point of view from a councillor's side. Thank you.
Yep, thank you, Councillor Punchard. Councillor Fitch-Tillett, would you like to
Thanks for that, Councillor Punchard.
contribute?
There's a couple of things I've picked up on. And those of you who are at scrutiny, just going back to what Councillor Withington was just saying, in coastal management at this stage and historically, we have had to be reactive. And we are doing our best as a coastal management team to be proactive, to find the trigger points where something might happen and manage it. And it's interesting something as well that Councillor Toy said. He mentioned wind and weather. The predictability is very, very marginal. Now, at the moment, the Environment Agency are working on the coastal erosion risk mapping. Now, that's about 20 years out of date. And there's still this belief that coastal erosion only happens from the sea. And actually, where we're concerned in our cliffed areas, most of the coastal erosion actually occurs because of groundwater in the cliffs. So I also found it quite interesting that both Councillor Dixon and Councillor Toy have a military background, which actually works on very firm rules. And unfortunately, the rule book goes out of the window when it comes to coastal erosion and risk mapping. So the best thing we can do is have that element of flexibility that can cope with anything that wind and waves actually throw at us. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Councillor Fitch-Tillett. Any other contributions or any issues? Councillor Holiday.
Thank you, Chairman. I know this is covered in our other policies, but I was thinking about sustainability. Shouldn't be requiring that anything that's rolled back be more sustainable than what was there before, considering the whole reason for rollback is unsustainability of our development. So, for example, what we're doing is replicating exactly what we've got already, pretty much. Should we be doing that? Should we not be thinking, is there a more sustainable way of re-establishing a caravan park, for example, because the carbon footprint is very high? Should we be thinking of other ways? I know it's implied in building new houses, but it seems something that's missing from this, and it should be whatever you do is got to be more sustainable than what you've done before, because otherwise we're going to be in an even bigger mess in 50 years' time. That was one thing. And the other thing was habitat recreation. I'd like to see more emphasis on that, because I think there's only a few paragraphs, and obviously that's also very important. Thank you.
So on the sustainability issue, the replacement development will be inherently more sustainable by virtue of the fact that when you replace something, it's got to be outside of the risk area. So one of the measures of sustainability would be the fact that you're moving from a risk area to a non-risk area. And such proposals have to comply with a whole suite of policies in the local plan. They don't just comply with the rollback policy. So if you're rolling back a dwelling, you'd have to meet all of our standards on carbon reduction, design, all the other things that are in the local plan would be relevant to that rollback proposal. And the indicators about sustainability are embedded in all of those other policies. Whether we can add some wording in here about the potential benefits associated with the reuse of existing sites and how nature-based solutions and other creative thinking might add to the benefit of the proposal. It's possible.
Yes, guys, I assume that biodiversity net gain will apply to any rollback re-site.
Yeah, it would, and there's potential here for additional benefit, because what you're doing is you're taking a developed area from the coast, and the expectation of policy is you return that area that's at risk basically to a natural state. You have to demolish the house, you have to do something with the land that's left, and it does strike me that there's an opportunity there to think about what we do with that land, rather than just say, knock this down and put grass on it. You could link the two things together and say there's an opportunity here to deliver net biodiversity gain or something else, which is a requirement of policy anyway. So.
Yeah. Does that answer your question, Councillor Holiday?
Not really. I just think we should be more innovative, because we're replacing car parks with car parks. We're replacing caravan parks with caravan parks. And are they the most beneficial to our environment? Are they the best things to do in terms of carbon footprint and thinking about the environment? I know these are all covered in our other policies, but if you look on a bigger scale, should we be being a little bit more imaginative about what we do?
Yeah, I mean, we're replacing car parks with car parks and caravan sites with caravan sites and dwellings with dwellings, because it's those things that help to sustain those communities. We've got an example. We've got a beach car park. People need to park, so we've replaced a beach car park. The caravan site at Haysborough is a cracking example. It's a large scale business. Lots of people on that caravan park will go to the pub, will go to the shop and so on, and use the services in Haysborough and help sustain those services in Haysborough. And the notion that we, when we're looking at rollback, let's get rid of the caravan park and replace it with something else that's not a caravan park, doesn't really play to that whole sort of rationale of the policy, which is about sustaining places as sort of living, working environments. But I think there are opportunities when you look at those replacements to deliver something better. I mean, I would say actually the replacement caravan park at Haysborough is substantially better than the one that it did replace. And there were very significant benefits in getting rid of the one that was there, which was in a very prominent coastal location. And I think the revised location is much better. The layout of the site, the landscaping of the site, and all of the other things on the site are a distinct improvement on what was replaced.
Yeah, I'm not sure what implications, if we didn't replace like for like, there would be on compensation for owners affected by this.
I mean, the other thing there would be no incentive for the landowner to do it. A landowner's not going to willingly give up a caravan site and say, I'll trade my caravan site for something else, which is a more community benefit. Unless there's a commercial value in it, it works as a business proposition. So we can't sort of lose sight of the fact that these things have got to be financially viable in order for them to happen. If they're not financially viable, then we'll be left with a situation where the risky development will just stay in the risk area. So it's about Angie's point about creating a policy context which not only allows for, but enables and promotes relocation, involves a conversation about how do we incentivize, and you get back to value and viability and making sure that people can actually get something out of it. Otherwise it just won't happen at all.
Rob, would you like to come in?
Yeah, just got a couple of things really. We are on as we always are, a journey on this, and many areas we need to sort of keep speeding along and accelerating along. And I think through the Coastal Transition Accelerator Programme, there could be some real opportunities. So, for example, around CO2, we don't have a great baseline and understanding about sort of how sort of CO2 when it comes to coastal adaptation is calculated or assessed, or one thing is better than the other. And that is an area of work that we do want to do sort of further assessment on, so we get a better understanding. Well, actually, if we are demolishing X and moving to Y, you know, what is the carbon cost? What's the benefits? What are the costs from doing that? And I think that's something we're going to develop our knowledge in sort of over the next few years. I also do think there's an appetite there from the conversations we've had so far around actually how we think about sort of replacements, how we think about dwellings, etc. You know, bricks and mortar, or looking to more sustainable passive house, for example. And there are cost implications, etc. on that. But through sort of, and this isn't the SPD, but it gives the guidance to do this. You know, if we do through CTAP, for example, look at replacing or moving things, well, you know, let's look at those opportunities to make them more efficient from a CO2 perspective, better insulated, etc., etc. So we're not there yet, but I think we're going to learn a lot in the coming years, which will then help inform us again as we sort of develop policy, etc., moving forwards. So I think that's a positive thing.
Councillor Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman. Just following up on those last points and from Councillor Holiday. Do we have any strategy whereby land that is now cleared, such as the former caravan site in Haysborough, and there'll no doubt be many others, do we have a policy of returning that to nature by rewilding, which would have additional benefits in perhaps reducing the movement of groundwater and therefore slowing some of the cliff erosion due to that? Thank you.
So the policy requires details of the reinstatement of the existing site to be agreed, but it doesn't go so far as what you're suggesting, which specifies that the reinstatement has to be done in a prescribed way. Can you leave it with me to have a think about it? I'll jot it down on the list, because we're getting into the realms of now amending local plan policy rather than talking about the content of the SPD. So I'm sort of anxious to keep the debate focused on getting the SPD out to consultation. My suspicion is that anything which adds additional cost is going to impact on the willingness of the landowner and the appetite of the landowner to relocate. And we need to think about that before we sort of go down that route. At the moment, the policy requires that the balances demonstrate there's no harm, taking into account the proposals for the relocation and the proposals for the existing site. And you basically got to get those two things in balance. Whereas what we're talking about now is delivering some betterment overall, actually securing a better outcome than the one that currently exists.
In an ideal world, I think that's what we should be doing.
So I'm happy to leave it with you. Yeah.
One thing which did occur to me as I read it, sorry, I'll come to you in a minute, John, was no reference to the deep history coast and the archaeological opportunities that ground disturbance present in the scheme of things. And I wondered if I was not looking in the right place when I read this. Is it relevant to coastal adaptation?
I don't think it'd be harmful to refer to it.
It's just that, you know, anyone reading this and who is aware of the deep history coast is sort of reading it and thinking there's no reference to it.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think a point was made there perhaps by Mark just now that yes, we do want to, you know, we want to see those changes that have been mentioned, and I would support that, but someone has to pay for it at the end of the day. So the landowner or the business that's got to relocate has got to build their new business. We're asking them to put things back. And as Mark said, if we make it too expensive, then will they move? And we're into other issues then. So we do need to remember that in some way, without giving favour to those people, because, you know, but finding ways to make it more affordable to achieve the things we'd like to see from people as they move. So whilst that's not a policy or anything we need to do, I think that we can necessarily write, but I think we need to understand the dynamics of how it's going to happen in reality as well. So I just wanted to make that point. I think we need to keep that in the back of our minds. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Toy. Rob, would you like to come in at this point?
Yeah, I was just sort of looking back at the SPD actually, and I think that's perhaps where some of the enabling development elements might come in. So actually, if we can have those early discussions in developing sort of these rollback opportunities, could bring in enabling development to then get the betterment as well. So it might be that through rolling back and doing some additional things with rolling back, then you can get the betterment on however the land's treated or the improved carbon efficiency or things like that. I think could be an interesting area. So yeah, but.
Well, I think unless anybody has any other questions or comments they want to raise, we can perhaps move to summarising what we've been discussing this morning. So really, we've got an amendment to the recommendations proposed by Councillor Dixon that we agree the supplementary planning document for coastal adaptation subject to wording on how planning policies can be implemented.
Flexibility or responsiveness.
Yeah, flexibility or responsiveness. So we can accept that as a further recommendation. I'd just like to say to officers who have worked on this, well done for all the work that you have done. Entering into a duty to cooperate arrangement with other local authorities is never easy from the start, even as a concept, as it were. So, and I think that it's interesting that, as Mark has mentioned, there is some flexibility in the document to take account of slightly different nuances in policy across other areas, which is interesting. It's not a total standardization, as it were. So that is very good to see. It's a nice glossary. I always like to see a glossary of acronyms, because by the time I've made a cup of coffee for like the third time while I'm reading it, I've probably forgotten what a 4-letter acronym such as a coastal erosion vulnerability assessment actually is when I reread it, but that's just me perhaps. So I think what I would like to do is just to look at the recommendations as printed. It's for members of the Planning Policy and Built Heritage Working Party to recommend to Cabinet that the draft coastal adaptation supplementary planning document be published for formal consultation. So it's not finished product, not the finished article, because it's a document that's the basis for consultation, which is fine. Delegated authority is given to the planning policy manager in consultation with the portfolio holder to make minor modifications and presentational or typographical amendments to the draft coastal adaptation supplementary planning document that arise from other relevant planning authority sign-off. So that's the partners in the consortium, isn't it, really, basically?
Yeah, we don't obviously have any control over what other working parties are doing here, and you've got potential, one working party going off in one direction, I was going in another direction. The officers need to reconcile those differences and get a document out to consultation. That's essentially what we're asking for. Otherwise, we'd be perpetually in a cycle. It's coming back to you next month and say, well, Yarmouth weren't quite happy with paragraph 15. They want a slight, So we're just looking for a bit of delegated authority to do the final draft. And I might suggest, people have raised archaeology, CO2 emissions, nature-based solutions, and various other things. maybe in the introduction, we could reference those things via, the relevance of other policies in the local plan. This is not a standalone document. It relates specifically to policies dealing with rollback and risk, but remind applicants there's a suite of policies dealing with, archaeology, carbon, all the other things that have been discussed. So they don't see this as a sort of, a very focused sort of, one-off piece of work without having reference to the rest of the local plan policies that we'd expect compliance with. So just explain that relationship somewhere up front. May already be there, but I think perhaps reinforcing that point might help.
Councillor Gay.
Yes, I support the recommendation. I'm just was going to say, I think mention of deep history coast would fit very nicely into paragraph 2.2. Very just so it's there. It's there. And then it could go into the glossary with a nice explanation of what the deep history coast was.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And people won't be thinking in future years, oh, didn't it exist in 2022? Yes, of course it did. Why isn't it mentioned? Is it? This isn't a time limited like local plan is timed out in 2036.
No, I think it's the sort of thing, resource permitting will be subject to periodic review. And as we've said, things will change. We'll learn from examples of rollback, and we might want to incorporate those into the document. So I think it's a living document that the partners will want to keep up to date. Government policy shifting all the time. We'd want to reference that. So it's, it doesn't have a date on the front cover that says this is time expired next year or anything like that.
So thank you for the proposal, Councillor Gay. Do I have a second, Councillor Dixon?
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to clarify a matter of process in relation to those sort of changes that we have been discussing, because it seems to me that in that second recommendation or second part of the recommendation, that delegated authority is given to both the planning policy manager and yourself as the portfolio holder to make minor modifications, and whether that was what you were going to do before that final version is published and consulted upon, or are you intending, I'm getting nods from Mark, which looks as though it's what you are intending. Is that correct? So they will be written in.
It's been sort of evolving for quite a while, this document. Everybody's on the same page. I think the universal agreement's a helpful thing to have. I think it's good to go out to consultation before we sort of finalise it. So I would anticipate that all the partners will endorse it and we'll get out to consultation relatively shortly. So the sort of delegation I'm looking for is, dare I say it, grammatical errors, spelling mistakes, presentational issues, and maybe the odd word here or there about deep history coast or whatever the other partners might come up with. Anything more substantive than that, I think we'd have to bring it through this cycle again.
That's fine. It just seemed to me to be common sense that those sort of things can be incorporated at this stage, so that the version that goes out for consultation includes all of those, and we've done and dusted those.
Yeah, I'm quite happy as portfolio holder to be the proofreader as well. Councillor Punchard.
Just a minor point, Mr. Chairman, about Appendix 1. Whether that needs updating. In principle, the appendix is no different in what we're trying to achieve, but one thing alone, I noted that the members who'd signed the document are no longer with us as councillors. Not that makes a huge amount of difference, but whether we need a more up-to-date one. Thank you.
The answer is definitely yes, and that's a good spot. I did actually think that myself. This was signed off by a councillor, Councillor Hilary Cox. I was thinking, That's unanimous. Thank you very much, members, for that. Right, so moving on to the next item on the agenda, item 9 is the local, rather appropriately, in view of what we've just discussed, the local plan update. Over to you, Mark.
Okay, so I'm not going to do a long sort of formal presentation, but I just wanted to explain where we are on the local plan, what I think is going to happen next, and give you a chance to ask me any sort of questions. And I covered some of this at the last meeting. So fairly recently, and I think you're all going to nod your heads now, we circulated a schedule of modifications to you. It was a very large document, which has got all of the representations in it that were made by people at what we call the Regulation 19 stage of the plan. So the Regulation 19 consultation is about the plan you intend to submit for examination. So it's largely finished. You think it's a good plan, you think it's sound, you consult on it, and then you submit that plan to an independent inspector, and they decide whether it's a good plan or a bad plan. As part of that submission process, you now get the opportunity, or you'd be wise to take the opportunity to think about the comments which were made during that Regulation 19 consultation process. And you are allowed to, and I would encourage you to, submit a schedule of modifications to the plan. So if somebody's written in and said, well, I think this is now out of date, it's the wrong sort of approach, I think you should modify the plan in this way or that way to make it a better or a sound document, you can schedule those changes and invite the inspector to make those changes through the examination process. It's not at this stage possible for you to modify the plan, accept those modifications and submit the modified plan to the inspector. What you're doing is you're submitting the Regulation 19 plan with a separate schedule of modifications which you're asking the inspector to consider. So implicit in that, you're saying the modifications which we're recommending are ones which we would be prepared to endorse. And then it's entirely up to the inspectors, whether they accept those modifications or not. And it's essentially their decision. And then they will write back at the end of the process and say, subject to these modifications, your plan is sound, or the modifications don't go far enough, your plan's not sound, you better scratch your head and think about doing something else. So that's either end of the spectrum. And through the examination process, the general approach of the inspector is to modify the plan where they can, where it's sensible to do so, to make it a sound document, rather than to just kick it out and say this isn't very good. So the whole mindset of the examination process is to work proactively towards getting to a conclusion that you've got a plan that can be adopted by the authority. So that's the sort of process. So what we're going to do, I hope this will be helpful to you, is you've got a schedule of representations which aggregates all of the representations by policy area. So if you look at policy HOU1 about housing delivery, anybody that said anything about housing delivery will be grouped together on the schedule you've got. So you'll be able to see pretty much in its entirety what people were saying about that particular policy. Notwithstanding that, despite our encouragement, they parked those comments all over the plan. You remember when we did the consultation, we tried to be quite rigorous about where people should submit their comments to make sure that their comments were linked to particular policy areas. And of course, that didn't happen. People put their comments, dotted them throughout the plan, and we've had to sort of aggregate them up and collect them all together. So you now have that complete schedule of representations by policy area. When these issues come to the working party, we're going to do something slightly different. They'll be grouped by policy area, but then subdivided into key issues. So let's take the HOU1 example for housing. We'll present a schedule based on sort of key issues which are raised. And those key issues will be, is the departure from the standard methodology that the councils use to work out the housing target justified or not? Does the plan propose too many homes? Does the plan propose enough homes? is the plan deliverable? Those will be the four sort of key issues that would sit under that sort of policy area. And there'll be others, there'll be minor changes and so on. So we will schedule out those, what we think are the sort of key issues that people are raising. And then we will make a recommendation as to whether we think modification is necessary or not. And we'll include some draft wording. And I'll be looking for the same sort of delegated authority so that I can scratch my head and think about it over Christmas and, if necessary, slightly modify and tweak the wording. So we end up in a position where we've got an endorsed schedule of proposed modifications that will get submitted. And we'd like to do that in two stages. First stage in December, looking at policy areas, that's the front end of the plan, strategic approach to development, that sort of thing. And then in January, look at the site allocations and deal with those as a sort of separate exercise, because the nature of the representations is slightly different in relation to sites, as you might expect, compared to, say, some other policies. And then if we can clear that through the working party in December and January, and then get endorsement of Cabinet and Council, we're then in a position to submit the plan. I can tell you now, there are a vast number of I'm going to call them trivial modifications. We call them itsy witsy teeny weeny ones, commas, spelling mistakes, double words like the appearing in and apostrophes, other things like that. I'm not going to schedule those modifications for you. We'll keep a record of them, but we're just going to make those as a matter of course. And we will invite the inspector to accept those en bloc. We won't be going through the plan saying add a comma at the end of paragraph 15, line 5. We'll add that comma, we'll schedule it, and we'll ask the inspector just to endorse all of those changes because they obviously improve the plan. So that would cover factual errors, updates. So for example, if there's been a new National Planning Policy Framework document published, the paragraph numbers would have changed. We'd like to get the right paragraph number in the document. There will be some areas of consistency where we might have had a standard policy approach, say on one site, but it doesn't appear on another site. It's an omission, it should have been there. It's a consistency modification, it doesn't alter the plan substantially. We'll do those sort of consistency checks and we'll schedule them. So the focus of the working party deliberations over the next couple of months will be on the more substantive policy areas where I hope and pray we've got all of the evidence to support what we've done, and instinctively we should be defending the plan rather than modifying it in any substantial way. If you modify it in a substantial way, you are running up against the likelihood of the need for further public consultation before you submit the plan. You know, you will get away with tweaking a site boundary or altering an odd policy requirement here or there. But if, for example, you were to say, well, actually, we're not persuaded by the scale of growth at North Walsham, let's put it all in Fakenham, that's a different plan. That you cannot submit. You would need to go through that process of doing another round of public consultation before the examination takes place. Until we get into it, I don't know how time consuming this task is going to be. When we're going through those policy changes now and looking at them, I don't anticipate a vast list of modifications. When you get down to the nuts and bolts of it, we probably all know what the top 10 or 12 sort of issues are likely to be, and we've debated those and discussed them ad nauseum at various working parties and come to conclusions on them supported by our evidence. So the areas of challenge should be relatively few in number, otherwise we've got something seriously wrong. We'll have to think again. So that's the process that we will go through, and the message from me is those meetings will only work if you're familiar with the representations. Hence, we've circulated them beforehand because there's a volume of reading material there to get familiar with stuff. Otherwise, we will spend inordinate amounts of time explaining the policies, explaining the representations, when really the focus ought to be on the nature of the modifications and whether it's necessary to modify the plan or not. bit of a sales pitch, really. So you're going to schedule with all of the modifications, which you've already got. You've got a separate schedule with the modifications listed out by sort of issue. This is a key issue. 25 people made similar comments, and you'll be able to trace those 25 people back to the schedule you've got, because they've all got reference numbers. So if you're curious, you'll know that it was Joe Bloggs or Mrs. Smith that made that particular comment, and you'll be able to, you know, reference that locally, because you'll know who's put that sort of comment in. So I just wanted to make sure we're clear on that sort of process wise and let you ask any questions about it.
Okay.
Thank you, Chairman. Will the inspector be interested in the quality of our discussion at those meetings? Will he have minutes? Well, it's just, I've been in an inspection where opposing counsel said, you councillors didn't really even think about this at all. Look, you hardly, you know, you talked about it for 10 minutes, you all agreed. And I'm curious, is he going to want to see evidence that we have weighed each of those modifications, or won't he care?
No, he will. Yeah, she, they will care, and they will have access to the minutes of the meetings, the papers from the meetings. They'll have access to the YouTube coverage now, so they'll be able to see those discussions that took place. But the key criteria, not necessarily about the quality of the debate and the discussion, but it's the quality of the evidence and the justification for the policy approach that's adopted. You know, the policies can't be based in sort of fanciful ideas that we dreamt up on a hoof and thought that would be nice. We should be able to trace back each of the policies to the core objectives of the plan, the sustainability criteria that we identified early on in the sustainability appraisal, and a rational explanation of why we're doing the things we're doing. You know, one of the tests is effectiveness. Are the policies going to be effective? Will they deliver what they say they're going to deliver? And as I say, the inspector, be curious about the debate, curious about the evidence, but will, largely speaking, want to assist the local authority in getting the plan over the line, and if necessary, modifying it through the examination process. So it's a sort of inquisitive, but not an inquisitorial process.
I just was concerned as to whether or not the inspector would be looking for evidence that we had given serious consideration to the consultation that had come into us. That's all really. If that would be of germane to him or her or not.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I don't. We should not pay lip service to the Regulation 19 representations in the interest of expediting the timetable. I think that's the answer you're looking for. That at the next couple of working parties, we need to do justice to the Regulation 19 representations. What you don't have to do is respond to all 950 individual comments which were made in microscopic detail, because you'll find when you get into them, of the 950 representations, they will group naturally into 20 or 30 areas. 20 individuals would have said the same thing, that the housing target is too high, there's lots of vacant property, we don't need all this building in North Norfolk. And we will have an answer for that, because the working parties considered that issue up to the Regulation 19 stage and come to a considered view on it. The difficult areas will be between Regulation 19 consultation and now, 6-8 months have elapsed, new issues which weren't evident previously. A good example would be nutrient neutrality. Did not appear in the Regulation 19 version of the plan. It wasn't an issue which was on the table at the time. The plan is entirely silent on the approach to nutrient neutrality. We'll have to put something in. Viability of development is shifting all the time. A year ago, we were talking about building rates falling off of a cliff, material prices going through the roof. You couldn't get labour, cost of development was going up. The viability assessment needs to be reviewed, has been reviewed to take account of those matters. That happened post Reg 19 consultation. Now, you could go round and round in circles consulting every time you get another evidence document and never get to the end game. Things move quickly. After Christmas, at some point, government's going to publish prospectus on the new MPPF. It's going to publish all sorts of potential changes to the plan making system. You know, levelling up bill, levelling up regeneration bill. Do you wait? Do you cogitate for 6 months on the content of that bill and modify your plan, or do you go ahead and submit and you know, get a decent plan in place? My hunch is that we're moving into an area where local plans previously had a shelf life of 15 years. They're going to be much shorter documents, more strategic in their content. They're going to be subject to continuous ongoing review. The process will never be a seamless, continual rolling sort of program. I think your new plan will put you in a good place on things like, you know, 5-year land supply and core principles, having growth sites available that will be suitable for the next 10, 15 years. But you'll be swiftly into plan review because the whole agenda is moving so quickly at a national level that the plan will, I think, have a shorter shelf life than the core strategy. I mean, the core strategy we did in 2008, we were preparing it years before then, and here we are in 2022. It's still a pretty good policy context for making decisions on planning applications. But I think, you know, we're into a period of fairly rapid change now, so the new plans are likely to have to evolve. The whole process will become much more flexible and less rigid to allow for that sort of continuous recycling of plans. I answered about 15 questions you never asked me there, I think, Virginia, but the key is at the next couple of meetings, you need to be comfortable that we've given justice to the representations, looked at the issues with, you know, a degree of rigor and scrutiny, and you know, rely on the officers to reference the evidence and tell you why we're doing the things we're doing. And if you're not comfortable, then you're not comfortable, and you'll need to take more time to reflect on it. I don't want to railroad it through and then face procedural criticisms that we didn't do this part of the process properly. Well, I think we will. I think we will.
Any other comments from members? Just following on from what Marcus said, it's no secret that I'm driving this forward as much as I possibly can from the chair for submission before the end of this present administration. So I'm going to apologise in advance for ruining possibly many Christmases this year, because I'm sure officers will be continually thinking about getting the plan into its consultation state. We were hoping to make the end of January. It's obviously it is going to go into February. We've got the two sessions next month and in January to look at the final wash-up, as it were, of policies and site allocations in the two meetings. And it is important that we are on top of that, and I'm sure that you will be as members. There has been some offline chat about how we proceed on this. We do in fact have a choice at this stage in the life of the plan. We can actually have Cabinet sign off the plan, the final draft, as it were, for submission, rather than going to full council, or we can send it to full council at this stage, like we would in the final stage when it's actually adopted and the inspector's happy with it and everybody's happy with it, and it's ready to go out into print and publication. But we've decided, I think, to put this through full council at this stage, not just through the Cabinet stage, because it fits our corporate plan in the sense that we want to be an open and transparent administration, and I think it's right that all members have an opportunity to scrutinise it before it goes to the inspector. So it will probably go to Cabinet after the January working party on the 6th of February. And then there will need, the next full council will be the budget setting full council. So we will probably need to have an extraordinary full council meeting just to deal with the local plan. So I'm just mentioning that. I can't see any other way of doing it if we are to get this to the inspector in a timely manner in this administration, because we don't want to be going into March and, leaving it to, Alex Ferguson time, if you like, that late in the day, because we're getting very close to, the election purdah period at the end of March. I think it's the end of March, Lauren, something like that, isn't it? So, that's what I'm hoping we will be able to do. So I'm just sort of setting expectation on it. And then we no longer need to look enviously at Kings Lynn and West Norfolk, who have already submitted their plan in the last couple of weeks. Councillor Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to say, speak in support of that view. And in fact, you, I think, used the term members should have an opportunity. I think actually I put that rather stronger. I think that members have a duty to see that document, if only to cover their own ward responsibilities, never mind the broader policy responsibilities that we all share, because we are but a relatively small number of the total 40 councillors that represent our respective wards. So if we, and I, as I said, I think that in terms of transparency, that's the only way, must be the best practice way. And I think it would also be wrong, once it's gone through the inspection process, to kind of present that to council, full council cold, or yes, it's gone all through the inspection process, but what has local member input really been? And I think that local member input, if they're not a part or attending this this working group, and the majority of councillors do not, therefore that opportunity needs to be created, and they need to demonstrate that they've had that not only opportunity, but they've discharged their duty to make sure that their residents and their business interests have been covered in their ward, if no other. So
it will achieve parity for members of this council who are not members of this working party to see what's been going on over a prolonged period. I mean, we've been looking at this for the last 3 years plus. So I think it's only right and proper that we do that, and it goes to full council. Councillor Gay.
Thank you, Chairman. I do support openness and transparency. I don't like secrecy and confidentiality. I'd just like to say in support of our fellow councillors, at the site allocation stage, most local members did turn up to discuss the site allocations. They did. So I think that deserves to be noted. And I presume the recommendation at full council will be to submit or not to submit. It'll be about submission. That's how it'll be phrased, won't it? Thanks.
Yes, it certainly won't be an opportunity for members who are not so familiar as we are to say, oh, well, I don't, I'm questioning that area. It won't be that. It will be the planning policy manager saying this is a sound, it satisfies the legal fitness test as a document, and we need to submit it. So it won't be reopening debate, if I can put it that way. Councillor Punchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I realise that this committee reports to Cabinet, but to what Nigel said, does it in any shape or form go through overview and scrutiny before it gets recommended? Or should it?
Constitutionally, I believe there isn't a requirement for it to actually go through overview and scrutiny. No. Because it's going to, and that's, in a sense, that's partly why it needs to go to full council.
Yeah,
for that very reason.
Yeah, thank you.
The Constitution only requires at this stage endorsement from Cabinet. You could stop there, but I think there are good reasons for wider membership sort of endorsement that it goes elsewhere. But theoretically, according to the Constitution, Cabinet could just sign off the submission version.
Okay, any final thoughts from anybody? And we can close up. Thank you very much for the update, Mark. That's been very helpful. Right, so we just moving on back to the agenda. We've got no press and public to exclude. With no exempt matters.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence, I'd like to just refer back to item 6, if I may, on the agenda, because whilst we did cover that in part, I'm not sure that we covered it in full. And the part that I'm concerned about concerns the infrastructure delivery plan. And I know you weren't present at the last meeting, Mr. Chairman, but I think probably it wouldn't be overstating it to say that that was an item that didn't go too well. Mark is chuckling. And I'm not entirely satisfied with, I think, the comment that he made that we would, that would come to us at a future meeting. One of the agreements that we made in respect of that plan, having discussed that there were a number of disappointments associated with the material that we were presented with. On page 8 of the minutes and paragraph Roman 10 did say that an early draft may be provided before its inclusion on the agenda. And I think there was an expectation that between that last meeting and this meeting, that we would have seen an early draft so that we may understand what's coming down the track and have an opportunity to comment and influence on that before it reaches our agenda proper.
Thank you, Councillor Dixon. Would it be fair to paraphrase that and say you want to know when it's coming forward next? And the sooner the better.
I would like to know specifically when it's coming, but I would like an early sight, and I would like, if you like, an undertaking that we agree that within the next 10 working days that we see that copy, that draft, please.
I can't give you that assurance from the chair. I'll have to defer to.
Well, as I say, I mean, I've seen a working draft of it, and I'm not going to say I've read every single word in the document. I've read most of it. I'd like to release it to members before the discussion at a subsequent meeting, because it is quite a beefy document in terms of its length. If nothing else, there's a lot of material to sort of get to grips with. But I'd like to release it to you when I'm happy with it. That's until I take timetables and sort of reading time and make sure I'm comfortable with it. Well, the alternative is I'll release a very early draft, you know, on the basis that there's still work to be done. But I've got the message. Before you consider it in detail next time, you want plenty of reading time ahead of a meeting to see the content of it if you're going to be asked to make a decision. I mean, I would say it's a bit unusual this to ask members to sign off sort of evidence documents. It's not a policy document, it's an evidence document. And it's a compendium of everything you've seen beforehand anyway. So you'll know that, you know, what the infrastructure requirements are for the North Walsham development, what the approach is to delivering school site contributions and so on and so forth. I don't think you'll be surprised by its content. And it was only coming to the last working party as a for information item, so you have an awareness of it rather than for you to actually endorse it and approve it in any way. But having started that process, put it in front of you and then taking it away, I think we need to put it back in front of you when we consider it's finished and ask you to look at it again. So,
yes, I mean, just to pick up on that point, I would have to, on the basis of what you described, how early it was and how concerned that you would be at us seeing it, I was just surprised that it was on the agenda, because if it's not ready to come to this working party, then that's fine, that's fine. Yeah. So it shouldn't, in my view, have been agended, because it was ever so light on content. If it came to us for information, then I would say it was very light on information. That's where our problem was, and that gives me some concern, really, that I wouldn't want to, bearing in mind how important infrastructure is, I would not want to be presented with a large document at a late sort of stage in the process that we have to sign off. And so giving a sight of what's coming down the track, I think is really important here. And I'm putting it quite light when I say that I was disappointed. I was actually amazed that we were not given the kind of information that was trailed to present. And actually, it's minuted in here that had we chosen to have had a recess for a few minutes, we would have seen it up on the screen. And so to bring it so tantalizingly close to you and then snatch it away and not present it to us for, but for my making the point today, we wouldn't be trying to fix a time specifically when this is going to come. And that's not, I don't think, very fair, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I think one of my concerns would be that we've got fairly hefty agendas for December and January for the reasons that we've gone through earlier. And therefore, if this comes to the December or the January meeting, we've got, quite a lot to look at. It's going to be, bring a packed lunch. It would be my recommendation for a meeting like that.
All the more reason for us to kind of see it in balance in the way, really, that we get a lot of digested and understood.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. Just think of the time, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. No.
This opportunity.
Yeah. 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 I think we can take that on board, can't we?
Definitely. So can we agree then when that actually when we're going to see that? Is it realistically going to happen then, or can we pick some other time? Because otherwise, what happens is that it just kind of moves to the wrong.
Yeah. Well, let's commit to the next 10 working days. I mean, I think it is an important document just in terms of awareness of its content. I think it will be extremely useful in terms of your discussions with parish councillors and others, because it explains how infrastructure is commissioned, the Section 106 process, community infrastructure, some of the background stuff that we sort of take for granted internally and were criticised because there's a lack of transparency. I think a lot of that will be answered within the document itself. And I think having that understanding of the relationship between development and the enabling infrastructure that it will provide, the transparency associated with that will be good as well. So I think it does deserve a profile beyond just, oh, here it is, take it or leave it. And it's just an evidence document, hence the reason why we tried to table it at the last meeting. What you would have got at the last meeting was just a compendium of the infrastructure projects contained in the document, not the document itself. And I suspect had we tried that, or to try that, you'd have been equally critical of the approach. So I think we get the whole thing out, warts and all, even if it comes out with an email saying this is still a little bit work in process, it's still evolving, but it's good enough for you to have it now. We need to get that done. So yeah.
I'm relieved to hear you say that, Councillor Dixon, to be honest. Right, getting back to where we were in the list of things. We were on item 11. There's no business under exempt matters to consider, and there are no items under item 12 either. So I think with everyone's forbearance, we can call a closure to the meeting at 11:38.